is an incredibly personal and humiliating attack. It's literally, blowing out the groins of Hezbollah fighters. Hezbollah has to not only show Israel that it's a proper fighting force, it has to show its own supporters, its own members, that it has that it is not that it's an organization worth following.
Now, Israel says it hit 100 Hezbollah rocket sites in Lebanon overnight, and there's serious concerns of an escalation of violence in the Middle East. Hezbollah's leader Hassan Nasrallah says the deadly pager and walkie-talkie explosions in Beirut, which Israel has not claimed responsibility for, had crossed all red lines and would be received as a declaration of war. Nadine Majzoub is a Lebanese journalist and says the country is still reeling from the explosions. We'll get a US perspective on this story in a moment, but first let's speak to Richard Spencer, who has covered the Middle East for The Times extensively. Morning, Richard.
Good morning.
Bring us up to date on these attacks overnight. We obviously had the statement yesterday evening by Hassan Nasrallah and then the response by Israel.
Yeah, again, it's always very hard when these things are happening to judge what their purpose is. That's not the point of carrying out these operations in war. But these do seem to be specifically timed to Nasrallah's speech. Just as Nasrallah's speech was about to begin yesterday, jets started flying very low over Beirut. Remembering this is not a country that itself Israel is formally at war with. In theory, they're just targeting Hezbollah, and Beirut is the national capital. So that was a very intimidating experience for everyone in Beirut, but it was clearly aimed at saying to Nasrallah and Nasrallah's supporters, we are watching you. We are not letting up. We're not going to be intimidated by anything you have to say. And again, with these strikes on presumably Hezbollah targets in the south of Lebanon, actual physical strikes, very intense strikes. This is a message to say to Hezbollah, we're up for a fight if you decide to retaliate for these pager attacks aggressively.
You've written a very thoughtful piece in the comment section of The Times today about on one hand, the chances of a ground invasion by Israel into Lebanon, and indeed things that you've been told.
Yes, so this has actually been a debate that's been going on in the Israeli upper echelons of both its political and military leadership, pretty much since the war on Gaza started at the end of last year. The question always is with Israel is do you have a war on one front or many fronts, because it has enemies on all sides. Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon. The Syrian regime is hostile, and is also, Syria itself is home to militias, including Hezbollah, but other Iran-backed militias that can and do target Israel. The question is, do you try and sort out all these issues all at once, or do you take them on one by one, but have this continual threat from all sides? With Hezbollah joining in the attacks after October the 7th, a lot of Israeli generals saying, why don't we just go in, clear Hezbollah out of the far south of Lebanon, close to the border area. Then we can move the Israeli citizens who've moved away from that area back. There are about 80,000 Israeli residents of the far north of Israel have become internal refugees, essentially moved elsewhere, leaving that area depopulated. And Israel wants to get them back for their own sakes, but also for symbolic reasons. Now, whether they do or not is still the big question. I think there's division still. There was when I was up on the border a few months ago. I was talking to generals and ordinary soldiers and ordinary residents of that area, and so the soldiers said, "Let's go, let's go, let's go." Of course, that's what troops do. The generals appear to be divided on the subject. So at the moment, I think they're holding off. I think they're still holding off. There was a suggestion that this Pages attack was a kind of precursor to a ground invasion, and in the piece I suggest it was actually an alternative to that. It was a way of getting at Hezbollah, showing Hezbollah what Israel can do without actually needing to take the massive risk of a ground invasion, as we've seen in Gaza. This is a process that is not only very bloody, but also brings a lot of criticism for Israel from around the world.
And Richard, we've spoken about lots on Times Radio about this is widely seen as an attack by Israel, by Mossad. Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, saying that red lines have been crossed. They see this as a declaration of war. We've heard this kind of language before, but with your experience, what's your assessment of how serious a situation we're in right now?
I think it's a very serious situation for Hezbollah. As I was saying to one of your colleagues the other day, this is a very, very unusual attack on Hezbollah. All the militias and enemies of Israel around the region are used to being bombed. They're used to suffering civilian casualties. They're used to fighting, often, sometimes not Israel, each other in some cases. In the Syrian civil war, for example, on the ground. This mass targeted attack on the physical bodies of Hezbollah operatives as they were doing their shopping, as they were sitting in their sitting rooms or watching television or whatever. Is an incredibly personal and humiliating attack. It's literally blowing out the groins of Hezbollah fighters. Hezbollah has to not only show Israel that it's a proper fighting force, it has to show its own supporters, its own members, that it has that it is not that it's an organization worth following. I mean, this is a very humiliating act for many thousands of Hezbollah members. So I think it is a dangerous moment, but possibly not for the reasons we think it is. I don't think this just means more escalation, more will there be a ground war or so? I think Hezbollah now have to rethink their strategy, and that could be, in fact, more dangerous in the long run for Israel and perhaps for the rest of the world. If they revert to what they did before, much more sort of terroristic type attacks, kidnapping, bombing buildings in third countries and so on, which Hezbollah has done in the past. They may feel that this is the way forward for them. I don't know. It's very hard to say. We don't know what the considerations of Hezbollah leadership is, but they must feel that their conventional strategies of building missiles and threatening Israel that way has not worked.
Richard, really good to get your assessment. Thank you so much. That is Richard Spencer. He covered the Middle East for the Times extensively. You can read his piece if you've got a digital subscription. Go online.
And so right now it feels like the closest we've been so far to all-out conflict.
Now, Hamas has warned that Israel will pay the price after a senior Hezbollah commander was killed in an airstrike on the Lebanese capital, Beirut. Ibrahim Akwil was one of several Hezbollah members among the 14 people reported to have died. Let's speak to Oliver Marsden, who's in Beirut for The Times. Morning, Oliver.
Morning.
Just give us a sense of what it feels like to be in Lebanon, in Beirut right now.
Well, as you can imagine, last night and this morning, the situation and the atmosphere is quite tense. It's been, well, I don't know really how to describe it, an incredible week of strikes and attacks, which culminated last night in the assassination, as you said, of Ibrahim Akil. I was down at the site and the atmosphere was very tense. There were many members of Hezbollah and many civilians around. It was sort of chaos and panic. This was a major security breach, another major security breach this week for Hezbollah. And understandably, they're incredibly worried, angry and paranoid. When I was down there, Hezbollah members were threatening to smash our cameras, smash my phone. They're not really taking any chances anymore, and they're very worried.
And how much do Hezbollah members represent the kind of wider view within Lebanon? What's the level of support in Lebanon for Hezbollah?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. There is a large supporter base amongst the Shia community, especially in Dahir, the southern suburb of Beirut, and in southern Lebanon, where the strikes are happening daily. Across Lebanon, there's mixed opinions about Hezbollah. Some people believe that Lebanon's only in this problem because of Hezbollah, and on the other side of that, there are many people, from the Christian community, from the Sunni community, who believe that Hezbollah are the kind of bastion, the kind of defense against Israeli aggression, and some people even believe that without Hezbollah, Israel wouldn't stop where they are now. They would be coming into Lebanon and they would be trying to take more Lebanese land. So as this continues and as the strikes keep happening, as targeted assassinations in civilian areas in southern Beirut happen, I feel that the support for Hezbollah actually grows rather than diminishes.
And clearly, you say you were down in the aftermath, at the scene in the aftermath of that attack yesterday, that Israeli airstrike, which took out a Hezbollah commander. Presumably, as you speak to people down there is a real fear of further escalation.
Of course. I spoke to one young man who he lived 2 doors down from the strike site, and his parents lived a bit further down the street. He was packing up his stuff. His wife was at home when the strike happened. They were moving. They're trying to move out of Beirut. Hassan Nasrallah said in his speech on Thursday that all red lines have been crossed, and so right now it feels like the closest we've been so far to all-out conflict. Hezbollah and Israel are already at war, but it feels like this could very much escalate into a wider regional conflict. John Kirby from the White House said that, war is not inevitable. There is a lot of diplomatic negotiations and conversations happening behind the scene, but the more that these targeted assassinations happen, the more strikes that happen in the south, it feels like we are very much at the edge, and I'm not entirely sure of a way back. For Hezbollah, this is very embarrassing and a huge security breach. So we're not sure what their retaliation will be, but I believe that they will have to do something rather large. They'll have to show face, and it's not looking or feeling very good right now here in Lebanon.
And you talk about it being embarrassing for Hezbollah. Clearly, it's also been hugely damaging to their organisation because a number of people involved in the organisation have been taken out. But my understanding is that there are many, many people who are involved with Hezbollah. Do we have a sense of whether they have the ability to launch some kind of major attack against Israel, or to react in a way that they want to? Do they have the capability to do that, bearing in mind the attacks of the last week?
Of course. Hezbollah is an incredibly significant and powerful fighting force here in Lebanon and the region. They have a stockpile of hundreds of thousands of missiles. They have the backing of Iran. There are Iran-backed militias in Iraq and Syria who have already confirmed their support for Hezbollah should something happen. Now, the killing of these commanders, these top commanders, especially Ibrahim Akil, who was the head of the Radwan forces, which I guess is like the equivalent of the sort of SAS or something. It's the Hezbollah version. This is a huge blow, but this isn't going to stop Hezbollah. They are extremely well equipped, extremely well funded, and these people can just be replaced. We had the assassination of Fawad Shukr less than 2 months ago. A similar airstrike on Dahieh killed him, and he was replaced. Now there's the strike on Ibrahim Akil. He will be replaced. And a fight with Hezbollah for Israel is a very different fight than with Hamas. They're very different beasts in terms of the numbers of soldiers that they have, of militants, and the equipment and the backing they have. We last year, quite randomly, they invited all the press to what you could describe as kind of war games up in the mountains of Lebanon. They showed off a lot of their arsenal, their weaponry, what they're capable of doing. It was quite impressive, and it came at a very strange time when nothing really was happening, but only a few months before October the 7th. So, I think they're very capable, and I don't think this is going to hinder them in the long run.
You mentioned that, of course, Iran back Hezbollah. Have we had much public response to what's gone on from Iran?
Nothing yet, nothing major, not since the assassination last night. But again, usually Iran are responding and saying how much, that they back Hezbollah, that they see Israeli attacks like these as a criminal, treacherous, quote unquote, events. They they talk about the civilian death toll, the fact that these pagers and walkie-talkies that blew up were embedded within the civilian population and blew up. They believe that this constitutes a war crime and crimes against humanity. And this is the usual kind of rhetoric that we have from Iran. It's anything that Israel does, they see as an act of war, and they see as a kind of illegal and intense reaction from an occupying force that they believe are in Israel and Palestine.
And finally, Oliver, before I let you go, just for people who aren't familiar with Beirut, just give us a sense of how life has really changed, what life was like, if it has, before the events of this week with the walkie-talkie and the pager attacks, and how people are behaving now. Are people going out to bars, to restaurants? Are they going to supermarkets? Day-to-day life, how is it being impacted?
Well, it's funny you say that, because yesterday I was thinking the same thing. And driving around, I went down to the south, the southern border, to a city called Sur, and on the beach there were people sunbathing, there were men jogging, there were women in bikinis sunbathing. Back in Beirut last night, as I drove back from Dahir back home, there were people in bars, people in the restaurants. I mean, the Lebanese have this reputation of sort of quote unquote being resilient. They are starting, unfortunately, to get used to this. One girl told me yesterday that we're used to this, we carry on. The attacks now are becoming more regular, and obviously Lebanon went through a major catastrophic civil war from 1975 to 1990, and then again in 2000 they had the war with Israel in 2006, and life goes on. The economy, which is already on its knees following the economic collapse, it needs to keep going. It needs to keep working. So restaurants are in fact even opening up. People are eating out. People are drinking. They're scared. There was way less tourism this summer, including Lebanese expats who live abroad. Not so many came back for the summer as they usually do. The streets are a bit more quiet, but considering what's happening, there is still a buzz about Beirut and life is still going on.
There is no doubt that Hezbollah is still a powerful military movement. It has a stockpile of precision-guided missiles and other weaponry that's on a scale nowhere seen in the Middle East, and as a militant group. However, and if we listen to its chief commander on Thursday, Hassan Nasrallah, for the first time, he acknowledged that these are hard hits and that they need to regroup, they need to reassess.
Now, one of Hezbollah's top military commanders was killed in an Israeli airstrike on Beirut. At least 14 people were killed and dozens injured in the attack on a suburb of the city, which is a Hezbollah stronghold. The Iranian-backed militant group has already been humiliated this week by attacks on their communication systems, with pagers and walkie-talkies being exploded remotely. Hezbollah has threatened to retaliate, but how damaged is the group? Joyce Karam is senior news editor for the news organisation Al Monitor, which reports on the Middle East.
Israel basically is doubling down on what has been one of Hezbollah's toughest weeks in its entire history. So it started on Tuesday with the pager attacks, then the walkie-talkies, then moving on to today, the killing of Ibrahim Aqil in the heart of South Beirut. Those are very detrimental events for the party since its existence in the early 1980s. Why today is uniquely hurtful for Hezbollah is because the strikes have hit its elite forces, the chain command of its elite forces, and the death of Aqil. This guy operates in the shadows. Me growing up in Lebanon, we've never, you don't see them, but they're very effective. He's, as we know from the US, he is implicated in the Marines bombing in 1983. We know he's also implicated in other big terror events in France, and then in the civil war in Syria. So we are seeing gradually Israel step up its attacks against Hezbollah. It sees that the party is scrambling, that its command and control are very much weakened, and it sort of knows that Hezbollah is not gonna go for the option of a full-blown war like the one we saw in 2006 or in 1982 with the Israeli invasion. So it's taking advantage of this situation and pushing harder, deeper into Beirut, into hitting the command and control and infrastructure of the party.
And so when you talk about Hezbollah being weakened, to what extent have they been weakened? Do they have an ability to respond in the way they may want to respond to Israel's attacks?
There is no doubt that Hezbollah is still a powerful military movement. It has a stockpile of precision-guided missiles and other weaponry that's on a scale nowhere seen in the Middle East and as a militant group. However, and if we listen to its chief commander on Thursday, Hassan Nasrallah, for the first time, he acknowledged that these are hard hits and that they need to regroup, they need to reassess. This is a language that we haven't heard from Hezbollah, not during or after the 2006 war, definitely not after 2000 and the big victorious celebration of Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon. So this is a different phase of the war. They're weakened, particularly because the hits from Israel have taken out big commanders in the party. Fuad Shukr was the boss of Aqil, who was killed today. They're also hemorrhaging commanders in South Lebanon. It's almost like they've entered this war on October 8th, thinking it will be similar to other Gaza war to last few weeks, but it's now has dragged almost to we're in the 11th month.
That's Joyce Karam, who is senior news editor for the news organisation Al Monitor, which reports on the Middle East.
Smoke billowed from a cell phone shop in Sidon, Lebanon on Wednesday after handheld radios used by Hezbollah detonated across the country's south. Lebanon's health ministry said several people were killed in the latest attack and hundreds were wounded. The death toll from Tuesday's pager explosions rose to 12, including 2 children, with nearly 3,000 injured. At a funeral for 4 of those killed by the exploding pagers, Hezbollah official Heshem Saifuddin promised a response.
This aggression inevitably has its own punishment. It has its own retribution. This punishment will come, God willing. We will not talk much, as tomorrow the talk will be for the master of the resistance.
Hezbollah said on Wednesday it had attacked Israeli artillery positions with rockets in its first strike at its arch foe since the pager blasts. A senior Lebanese security source said the explosives were planted months earlier by Israel's spy agency, Mossad. Israel's military has declined to comment on the blasts.
It's imperative that all parties refrain from any actions that could escalate the conflict.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, in Cairo to advance efforts to secure a ceasefire in Gaza, said the detonations in Lebanon threatened to derail diplomatic efforts in the Middle East. Later, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the incidents risked a dramatic escalation in the region.
Because obviously, the logic of making all these devices explode is to do it as a preemptive strike before a major military operation.
A security source said the handheld radios were purchased by Hezbollah 5 months ago, around the same time the group bought the pagers. Two sources familiar with the group's operations told Reuters its fighters began using pagers, hoping to evade Israeli tracking. A Reuters reporter in the southern suburbs of Beirut said he saw Hezbollah members frantically taking out the batteries of any walkie-talkies on them that had not exploded. Meanwhile, Israel released video on Wednesday that showed Defense Minister Yoav Gallant telling troops that more forces were being sent to the northern border, where Lebanon borders Israel, as the war moved into a new phase.
There's a sense that this is very much an attack on Lebanon, not just on Hezbollah or on Hezbollah areas, because especially when you take into consideration the operations that caused the pagers and the walkie-talkies to explode in the last week that have killed so far 37 people, and this is aside from the strike that was caused by the missiles yesterday on the residential building. That happened all across Lebanon. That wasn't a targeted strike. So it's instilled very much a sense of fear and terror into the average Lebanese person.
Well, joining me now is Nada Homsi, Beirut correspondent at The National. Nada, thank you so much for giving us your time.
Hi, thanks for having me.
What is the mood currently on the ground?
The mood is pretty stark on the ground of the strike. People are still looking for their loved ones. It's the second day since the strike happened. We're on day 2 now. And we just had Lebanon's transportation minister say that officially there are still 23 people missing, likely still under the rubble. And we don't know in what state. Probably not good. But so you still have families and friends and neighbors that are sitting on the sidelines of this cordoned off area from where the strike happened, and they're praying, they're asking rescue workers about their loved ones, what happened to them. A lot of people are crying, and a lot of them have taken to social media to post photos of their children and their loved ones, asking for any information, because those that have been rescued, it's such chaos that they might be in hospitals. So families are even checking from hospital to hospital to make sure that their kids haven't already been saved without their knowledge, and that they aren't potentially injured and hospitalized.
Nada, what do we know about the strike itself? From what we understand from the Israeli military, this was targeting a Hezbollah meeting of top commanders that was taking place in a building in a bunker deep underground.
This is what Israel says, and it seems that Hezbollah has corroborated this by acknowledging the death of top commander Ibrahim A'il and a number of other commanders as well who were in Hezbollah's elite operations force, the Radwan forces. So I can't speak as to whether they were in an underground bunker or not, because we can't get close enough to the site of the strike, but it does seem from Hezbollah's acknowledgement that this is the case.
What is the national mood towards Hezbollah as well? Because we do hear that, for example, some of the areas that are considered safe, that are not Hezbollah strongholds, life perhaps goes on as normal. What are the Lebanese people feeling right now towards Hezbollah?
This really depends on who you speak to. First of all, Lebanon is a very stratified society politically, but you have to keep in mind that Hezbollah is very much part of Lebanon's governance, its parliament, its social structure. It's a part of Lebanon in every way. So there are people that are very, very dogmatically anti-Hezbollah, people that are dogmatically pro-Hezbollah, but the majority of people, I would say, are in the middle. The feeling this last week, overall, again, it depends on who you speak to, but there's a sense that this is very much an attack on Lebanon, not just on Hezbollah or on Hezbollah areas, because especially when you take into consideration the operations that caused the pagers and the walkie-talkies to explode in the last week that have killed so far 37 people, and this is aside from the strike that was caused by the missiles yesterday on the residential building. That happened all across Lebanon. That wasn't a targeted strike. So it's instilled very much a sense of fear and terror into the average Lebanese person. Yeah, so it really depends on who you speak to, what their perception of Hezbollah is. But the perception nationwide is also that this has essentially been a terrifying week for them, and the perpetrator has been Israel.
How much have Hezbollah suffered with the pager attacks, the walkie-talkie attacks? Yesterday, we've had senior commanders that were both killed in this strike. Do we know what state the Hezbollah organization is in? Because the rocket attacks on Israel from Lebanon do continue. We had more rockets yesterday, Friday, heading into Israel. So has Hezbollah suffered a bigger blow than usual? Have their operations been at all dented from the last few days and what we've seen going on in Lebanon?
That's really hard to say because Hezbollah is a very secretive organization. It's also a very large organization that, again, is very much embedded into Lebanese society and social structure. Um, if you were going to ask analysts, they would say that if you cancel out or assassinate, some commanders, some more will take their place. But there is no hiding the fact that Hezbollah has taken some very big hits over the last week. So whether they're going to be able to recover fully or not, we don't know. But we can say that they have remained absolutely defiant, and they have maintained that they will keep sending rockets into Israel, and they will maintain these cross-border attacks for as long as it takes until a ceasefire is declared in Gaza. This has been happening since October, and they've been essentially saying that they're waging a pressure front from Lebanon in order to pressure Israel into a ceasefire in Gaza and into ceasing its assault and invasion of Gaza as well.
We were also hearing that there were previous negotiations for Hezbollah to retreat further into Lebanon from the northern Israeli border. I'm assuming that all those negotiations now are a complete standstill.
This is hard to say because every time that there is a series of attacks that makes us think that these negotiations are going to come to a standstill, you have a politician from either side of the border or even in the US say that, no, we're still going to try to continue these negotiations. But I think it's become very clear after a year that these negotiations by now are essentially a facade because this war is very much continuing. And what is happening between Hezbollah and Israel right now is very much a war. You can say that it's a lower intensity war than a full-out regional escalation or a regional war, but it is nonetheless still a war with high casualty rates.
And finally, Nada, there seems to be confusion as to which parts of Beirut, which parts of Lebanon are safe. How much instruction has been given out by the authorities to people to leave their homes, or which neighborhoods are considered safe enough for people to remain? Is there confusion on the ground of what people are meant to do?
You would think so, given when you take into consideration that Lebanon's political structure is very feudal right now. The government is in a caretaker capacity. The parliament isn't meeting in full capacity, and there's no president. So it's questionable how much instruction the Lebanese government is able to provide. They're able to prepare as much as possible, but when it comes to evacuations and stuff, because it's very feudal, each political party essentially controls specific areas of Lebanon. So you have municipalities and political parties that are in charge of declaring whether there's going to be evacuations or not. Usually it's up to people. People in their villages and in their areas know where is safe and where is not. So essentially it's usually very local kind of organization that's happening on the ground.
Nada, thank you so much for giving us your time. Nada Homsi there, Beirut correspondent at The National.
I would say the majority of Lebanese are against Hezbollah. The Shia community, where Hezbollah has basically its stronghold, because it is a Shia political group at the end of the day, claiming to represent the Shia community in Lebanese politics. The Shia community is around a third of the Lebanese population. Not all of them support Hezbollah, but the majority do. And they do that because of fear, because they feel they have no choice, and some of them support because they actually believe in Hezbollah. So the reasons vary, but the majority do. But when it comes to other groups in Lebanon, the majority actually do not support Hezbollah.
Well, the Israeli Defense Forces have said they've struck more than 100 Hezbollah targets in southern Lebanon overnight, including launchers and what it described as terrorist infrastructure. Hezbollah also says it has fired dozens of missiles at an Israeli airbase in response to repeated attacks. It claims to have 100,000 fighters in its ranks, but Israeli officials say the entire senior command of Hezbollah has now been eliminated. Well, let's find out more about the organisation with Lina Khatib. She is an Associate Fellow of the Middle East and North Africa programme at the Chatham House think tank. Lina, thanks for joining us this morning. Perhaps you could just educate us a little bit about who Hezbollah are, where they emerged, and really it was the early 1980s and the war with Israel that appears to be the origins of them. Just talk us through that.
Yeah, absolutely. Hezbollah did emerge in the 80s in Lebanon, in the early 80s, following Israel's occupation of Lebanon at that time. The Israeli invasion happened in 1982, and Israeli troops stayed in southern Lebanon for almost 20 years, till 2000. And during this time, Hezbollah emerged in the south of Lebanon as an armed group, hell-bent on liberating Lebanon from Israel. And from the very beginning, this group was created partly by Iran and supported financially and militarily by Iran. And this support remains until today. So Hezbollah is a Lebanese group, but it's very much also a very important part of Iran's attempt at regional influence in the Middle East.
I wonder if you could tell us about their tactics of obviously it's a prescribed terrorist organisation by many governments right around the world, including here in the United Kingdom. I was reading what Jeffrey Goldberg wrote in the New Yorker about the sort of original period in the 1980s. Hezbollah, he says, quickly became the most successful terrorist organisation in modern history, serving as a role model for terror groups around the world, virtually inventing the multi-pronged terror attack when, early in the morning of October the 23rd, 1983, it managed to synchronise suicide bombings in Beirut of the United States Marine barracks and an apartment building housing a contingent of French peacekeepers. These attacks occurred just 20 seconds apart.
Yes, I mean, in the 80s, Hezbollah stood out because it was backed by Iran to such an extent that it had resources that other groups did not have. And it really benefited from training by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Remember that Iran had been around that same time fighting a war with Iraq. The revolution had happened, the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 79. It was a very bloody period with high level of military activity that got transferred basically in terms of expertise to Lebanon. And this is what allowed Hezbollah to have the upper hand, not just over Israel, but also over other groups in Lebanon at that time, because Lebanon was going through civil war. There were other militias in Lebanon at that time, including Muslim Shia groups, mainly a group called Amal, which is Hezbollah's predecessor. And eventually Hezbollah managed to overwhelm that, to assert itself, meaning Hezbollah as the only representative of the Shia community politically, even though Amal is still there. But Hezbollah managed to overwhelm even groups that came from the same basically political and social background. And Hezbollah has since then become Lebanon's most powerful armed group, even more powerful than the Lebanese army.
And just in that regard of it being the most powerful group, what is the attitude of the Lebanese people? I'm sure there are many who have varying views. It's a very diverse country in many ways in terms of political views, and its culture is a very advanced one. I just wonder how much support there actually is for Hezbollah in Lebanon today.
I would say the majority of Lebanese are against Hezbollah. The Shia community, where Hezbollah has basically its stronghold, because it is a Shia political group at the end of the day, claiming to represent the Shia community in Lebanese politics. The Shia community is around a third of the Lebanese population. Not all of them support Hezbollah, but the majority do. And they do that because of fear, because they feel they have no choice, and some of them support because they actually believe in Hezbollah. So the reasons vary, but the majority do. But when it comes to other groups in Lebanon, the majority actually do not support Hezbollah.
How about this week, and how much of a blow will it have been, the sophisticated, audacious attack by Israel with the pagers, with walkie-talkies? There must be a lot of insecurity within Hezbollah terrorists. There must be a lot of worry from people in Lebanon. We've been speaking to people at various points over the last couple of days about this. But I just wonder, in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of the leadership of Hezbollah, obviously a number of them have been assassinated, how it stands now as opposed to how it stood a week ago, in your estimation?
Well, a week ago, Hezbollah was still riding on the decades of so-called success that it had been using to kind of present itself as this almost, impenetrable group. It claimed success when Israel withdrew from Lebanon in 2000. It claimed success when it had a big war with Israel in 2006. But now, this new attack is something that Hezbollah was not prepared for, did not see coming, and it's the biggest blow for Hezbollah in its history. So it is in a state of disarray. It is limited now in terms of what it can do militarily against Israel, simply because its communications network has been deeply intercepted and infiltrated by Israel. So it really is limited operationally.
Lina, thank you very much indeed. That's Lina Khatib there, who is Associate Fellow of the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House, the think tank in London.